Even though the aggregation wizard is a mathematical approach to designing aggregations and might produce some aggregations that help and other aggregations that don't help, it's still a good place to begin. To get the best set of starting aggregations, there are several things we can do to optimize dimensions for the aggregation wizard. The first thing we can do is to delete attributes from a dimension that users don't need. A common mistake with new developers is to provide every possible attribute in a dimension with the idea that the users can request data in any possible way. In small cubes, this is generally not a problem, but in a large, complex cube, extra attributes can take up space unnecessarily and trigger aggregation designs unnecessarily, so it's best to leave them out. User hierarchies are important for aggregation design. As we learned earlier in this module, analysis services can build aggregations at one level of a hierarchy that can be used to derive values at a higher level. However, creating user hierarchies is no guarantee that an aggregation will be built. Now, just because you arrange attributes in user hierarchies doesn't mean the attribute relationships are correct, so it's very important to check this as well. Another option is to disable an attribute hierarchy if it's used only for calculations or it needs to be available for reporting inquiries but won't be used for analysis by users. In other words, think about whether users will need to put the attribute on rows or columns or filters. If it's used for other purposes, like showing a tooltip or being used as part of a calculation, then we can treat it as a member property. And it's still accessible in MDX queries using the property function, but it won't be in the metadata pane for users to drag and drop into a query. To remove it from consideration for aggregations, we can set the attribute hierarchy enabled property to false. This can be done at the cube level or the dimension level. However, the aggregation usage property is set only at the cube level. We can configure aggregation usage in the aggregation wizard, but we'd have to reset it each time that we want to run the wizard. To keep it set the way we want, we can configure the property on the cube structure pane for each attribute, as discussed earlier in this module. The estimates that the aggregation wizard asks for are necessary for the analysis services algorithm to work properly. If we have multiple partitions in a cube, it's especially important to make sure that we get the estimates correct for the number of attribute members in a particular partition. As we'll see in a later module, we can have partitions that contain different combinations of data, with a month's worth of data in one partition and a year's worth of data in another partition. In that case, we would set the month attribute to 1 in the month partition and to 12 in the year partition. Estimates are estimates. We don't have to worry about being precise. Now, the count button in the wizard will get actual counts, but if we're working with a subset of data rather than production data, we won't get the right count, of course. So we can manually update this value, and we should be close. That is, it's much better to be within a few 100,000 rows for a partition than to give a value that is incorrect by millions of rows. The key is the relative number of dimension members to the partition size and whether an aggregation is going to have more than 1/3 the number of rows that are in the partition.